19th century was fueled by an explosion of technological innovation, backed up by a lot of hard work. The cotton gin was rapidly boosting cotton production in the South. Steamboats were churning up the Mississippi River. Power looms were transforming the New England textile industry. By mid-century, the telegraph would drastically increase the speed of long-distance communication. And Americans were on the move. Transportation was greatly improved, and people relocated in record numbers to the burgeoning cities of the Northeast or out west in search of land and economic opportunity. Together, these social and technological changes created what's been called a market revolution.
The market revolution can most simply be defined as growth of commerce, of buying and selling on commercial markets. And during this time, you had the expansion of transportation, you had growth of turnpikes, improved roads, canals, railroads, introduction of the steamboat, which greatly reduced transportation costs and which encouraged people to buy and sell, whether they would be farmers, artisans, manufacturers.
You had an intensification of commerce. You had an increase in the number of occupations, just as you had an increase in the number of commodities that people could buy, which led to a retail specialization. So you can see the market becoming denser and more complicated at this period, and it is the carrier of opportunities.
At first, the sight of so many bands and wheels and springs in constant motion was very frightful.
The cotton boom of the early 19th century fueled the first large-scale manufacturing in the United States. Textile mills began to spring up across the Northeast, and towns grew up around them to house their workers. This innovation not only changed the textile industry, it transformed the social landscape as well.
With the development of the carding machine, the spinning frame, and the power loom, and the growth of textile production in factory settings, we begin to see the birth of a female labor force. They're beginning to see possibilities. They're beginning to see the possibilities for consumer goods that weren't there before. They're beginning to have some questions about what the possibilities are in the countryside for them, whether or not there really are opportunities for them. They're going to the city to earn money for themselves, sometimes to help their families, almost certainly to put away something toward their own marriages later in life, at a time when families are beginning to have a bit of trouble assuring all their children a place in the countryside.
In 1813, Francis Cabot Lowell, a clothing manufacturer, returned to Boston energized by an invention he had seen while on a business trip in England. He reconstructed a power loom from memory, then went on to establish several textile factories along the banks of the Merrimack River. The town of Lowell, Massachusetts, was born. By 1830, more than 6,000 young women were employed in 8 different mills in Lowell alone. These women, most of them between the ages of 16 and 23, labored in hot, poorly ventilated workrooms, surrounded by noisy machines.
For this effort, standing on their feet 12, 13 hours a day, they made in the 1830s maybe $3.50, $3.25 a week. So they made 4 or 5 cents an hour would be what they were paid. Out of that $3 and something a week, they'd pay $1.25 a week for their room and board in the boarding house. But this meant that they could save $1.75, maybe $2 a week. And over time, some of them might develop a bit of a savings account in the local savings bank and have some money to take back to them when they were done.
Harriet Hanson Robinson came to Lowell in 1834 when her mother took a job running a company boarding house. At the age of 10, Harriet went to work in one of the Lowell factories as a bobbin girl.
I can see myself now racing down the alley between the spinning frames, carrying in front of me a bobbin box bigger than I was. We mites had to be very swift so as not to keep the spinning frames stopped long.
Harriet worked her way up from bobbin girl to tending a spinning frame and then to a better-paying, skilled position as a drawing-in girl.
We drew in, one by one, the threads of the warp through the harness and the reed, and so made the beams ready for the weaver's loom.
In 1834 and 1836, the female workers banded together to protest attempts to lower their wages.
When the day came on which the girls were to turn out, those in the upper rooms started first, and so many of them left that our mill was at once shut down. Then, when the girls in my room stood irresolute, I became impatient and started on ahead. I marched out and was followed by the others.
But by 1840, the fledgling women's labor movement at Lowell was undercut by an increasing supply of immigrant workers.
There was a ready supply of Irish immigrant workers to come into the mills, and as the Irish come into the mills more and more, you begin to see the mills changing character. As the mills grow between, let's say, the 1840s and 1860s, they don't tend to build as many boarding houses. So more and more of the workers are expected to find their own homes somewhere in Lowell. More and more of them come to Lowell as whole families, with the women working in the mills, perhaps the men working on canals or doing unskilled labor in Lowell, so that as the wages relatively go down and as the workforce is transformed from a rural migrant labor force to an immigrant labor force, what particularly distinguished Lowell from other places begins to disappear.
In 1848, Harriet, at age 24, left her job in the mill to marry William Robinson, a Lowell newspaper editor. They remained in town. Many Lowell girls, having tasted city life, chose not to return to the hard rural existence of their parents.
You find a number of women who had been mill operatives become active in the women's rights movement that evolves, so that there definitely are people who I would say became familiar with the idea that women could have a public presence and could protest ill treatment. And they carried that over from the class issues that they first addressed while working in the mills to more political and social issues for women generally in American society.
Woman is never thought to be out of her sphere at home, in the nursery, in the kitchen, over a hot stove, cooking from morning till evening, over a wash tub, or toiling in a cotton factory 14 hours per day. But let her once step out, plead the cause of right and humanity, plead the wrongs of her slave sister of the South or of the operative of the North, and a cry is raised against her, out of her sphere.
We should look upon each other something as a band of orphans do. We're fatherless and motherless, we're alone and surrounded by temptation. Let us caution each other. Let us watch over and endeavor to improve each other. Let us strive to promote each other's comfort and happiness. I say, let us all strive to do this, and if we succeed, it will finally be acknowledged that factory girls shine forth in ornaments more valuable than gold watches.
Newspapers at Lowell provided factory girls with an opportunity to express themselves and often to defend themselves in print. The Lowell Offering was a literary magazine with the mission of showing what factory girls could do without sacrificing their femininity. The Voice of Industry was a labor newspaper that focused more on social reform. The Lowell Offering and the Voice of Industry were just two among a plethora of publications that flourished during the 1830s.
Just incredible, the number of printing presses and newspapers and reform movements and religious movements that used print media. And this, of course, puts a tremendous premium on literacy, so that all these little rural areas have formed districts, so at least their children will go to school maybe 15 months in a 10-year life, but they will become literate. So this is not just related to economic development, it also has something to do with political development, but you can see how they're interactive. You have a more literate public, then you have people that make more of a demand for printed works. You have a demand for printed works, you've got occupations for more writers. It's interactive and mutually enhancing, these developments.
July 4, 1817. Daybreak. Cannons roared as a crowd gathered near Rome, New York, to witness the beginning of America's most ambitious construction project to date. The honor of shoveling the first spadeful of dirt for the Erie Canal went to Judge John Richardson.
By this great highway, unborn millions will easily transport their surplus productions to the shores of the Atlantic, procure their supplies, and hold a useful and profitable intercourse with all the marine nations of the world.
After that first symbolic spade plunged into the ground, members of the crowd, along with the hired workers, eagerly followed suit. The nation's first major public works project was underway. The goal was to create a 363-mile-long artificial waterway. It would connect the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie in Buffalo by following the contours of the Mohawk River Valley.
The Erie Canal was the child of Governor DeWitt Clinton. He saw that New York had a unique geographical feature, which was a gap in the Appalachian Mountains, which otherwise run uninterrupted from New Hampshire to Georgia. But at Albany, there is a gap, and so you could put a canal through there, run it to the Great Lakes, and thus trade with the trans-Appalachian part of the country, which is a very large, rapidly growing part of the country at the time.
Another very important factor was New York City. Merchants in New York City are looking for access to the West. They know if they can have access to the West, that they'll be the #1 port of entry for goods coming into the United States, as well as being the #1 commercial depot for grains and other goods being produced by the farm economy of the Midwest coming to New York.
And DeWitt Clinton just became determined to do it. And he tried to get the federal government to fund it. The federal government turned it down. Jefferson thought it was an absolutely lunatic idea. But Clinton got it through the New York State legislature. He was a masterful politician.
Clinton's tireless support of the canal would prompt his critics to call the endeavor Clinton's Big Ditch. Despite their sneers, popular support for the project grew each year. By 1823, the eastern end at Albany was completed. In honor of the occasion, a resident of Brockport, New York, offered a toast.
To our internal navigation, pork and flour coming down, tea and sugar coming up. Things are as they should be, some up, some down.
In 1823, another milestone was achieved when the western end at Buffalo was finished. But the midsection still needed to be completed.
They were grave doubts about the engineering capabilities of the day. Most of the engineers who worked on it were actually quite amateur engineers by the standards of our day. Most of them were prominent gentlemen in New York who had some experience surveying and some experience in engineering, but no formal education in engineering itself.
The Erie Canal had to overcome a 573-foot differential in elevation from beginning to endpoint. Ultimately, 83 locks were required to raise and lower boats along the way.
It certainly strikes the beholder with astonishment to perceive what vast difficulties can be overcome by the pygmy arms of little mortal man, aided by science and dictated by superior skill.
The canal engineers did a great deal of improvising as they went along. In addition to their ingenuity, the project required the brute strength and endurance of nearly 9,000 laborers who felled trees, hauled boulders, rechanneled streams, and shoveled tons of dirt.
The Erie Canal was the last major public work to be built almost entirely by hand. It was built by thousands of workers using pick and shovel, and they simply dug it. And they blasted out rocks and stuff like that, but otherwise it was done entirely by hand. Many of them by immigrant labor, many of them Irish.
I think being here is better than staying in Ireland, landless and powerless, without food or clothing.
Most canal laborers lived in dismal circumstances and were paid under $1 a day. Their meager salary was augmented by an allotment of whiskey and food.
There's so many Irish keep coming every day, and they work so cheap, it makes it bad for laboring people.
In 1825, after 8 years of effort, the canal was finally completed all the way from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. That year, over 40,000 passengers traveled upon it. The barges only traveled at 5 miles per hour, but they still cut the travel time between Albany and Buffalo in half. There were no luxury accommodations on the overcrowded, mosquito-infested barges. Passengers had to fling themselves on deck each time they passed under a bridge to avoid decapitation. But during the next few decades, millions traveled the Erie Canal for business and pleasure. And it revolutionized the movement of goods, bringing wheat, pork, cattle, and whiskey to the east, and sending textiles, household goods, books, guns, and people to the west.
Previously, Western farmers had to ship their goods either down the Mississippi and then through New Orleans and then around Florida, or up the Great Lakes to Montreal and the St. Lawrence and to the Atlantic. Before the Erie Canal, it would have cost about $120 to ship a barrel of flour from Buffalo to New York City. After the Erie Canal, it cost about $6 and took about, 1/3 the time.
New York City was by far the biggest winner of the Erie Canal. It got a head start in capturing the trade of the Midwest. And because people were shipping grains and other goods to New York City became a natural place in order to manufacture goods as well.
As Oliver Wendell Holmes, the poet and the Supreme Court Justice, said that the Erie Canal in New York City had become that tongue that is licking up the cream of commerce of a continent.
In 1836, John Deere emigrated from Vermont to the Illinois frontier. 2 days after his arrival in Grand Detour, Illinois, he set up a forge and went to work as a blacksmith. In 1837, Deere successfully forged the first self-polishing, steel-bladed plow, soon dubbed the singing plow, for the sound it made as it cut right through the thick, gummy soils of the Midwestern prairie. Deere quickly turned his invention into a lucrative business that was instrumental in the expansion of farming in the Midwest. By mid-century, Deere was selling over 13,000 plows a year. In 1868, he incorporated, establishing Deere & Company, a manufacturing operation that is still a major player in the farm equipment business today.
No poor man in the eastern states who has feet and legs and can use them has any excuse for remaining poor where he is a day or even an hour.
The one thing that almost all people had in common was a search for independence. Many Americans valued propertied independence of owning their own farm or perhaps owning their own shop. And as the seaboard states became increasingly populated, land ran scarce in those states. The way people at the time envisioned the economy working is that you might work as a wage laborer in an older seaboard state, accumulate enough savings to move west and to buy your own homestead. And that was the ideal that many Western settlers strove for.
Thanks to improvements in transportation, like the Erie Canal, tens of thousands of white settlers relocated to the northwestern prairies in the mid-19th century. The combined population of Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa went from 500,000 to 5 million, a growth rate 4 times greater than that of the country as a whole.
There was very rich agricultural land available, and you had a population of people who were farmers, and they were farmers' sons and daughters who'd started working when they were 7 or 8. They knew how to do all the tasks that would be involved in taking a wilderness and turning it into fertile acres of production. There was also the fact that the United States Army was willing to fight the indigenous population, which fiercely defended their homelands.
The federal government promoted Western expansion in other ways as well.
The road system was not very well developed, but a bad road was better than no road at all, and it was usually federal and state governments that built the earliest roads in these territories. And then land policies was also especially important, and the federal government owned most of the land in the old Northwest, and the federal government was willing to sell that land quite cheaply to settlers, especially to independent family farmers.
The town of Jacksonville, Illinois, was the product of the agricultural boom on the frontier. Named for the brash military hero Andrew Jackson, it began in 1825 with the construction of 3 taverns. The following year, a meeting house and a school were added.
Few towns have risen so rapidly as Jacksonville. About a dozen frame buildings finished in good style have gone up the last year.
By 1830, it had nearly 13,000 residents. That same year, a small college was founded with an initial enrollment of 9. The town boosters began referring to Jacksonville as the Athens of the West.
Jacksonville is destined to become one of the most prosperous as well as one of the most beautiful cities in the state.
But various social problems accompanied Jacksonville's rapid growth. Julian Sturdivant, who was invited to town to give a sermon to Jacksonville's Presbyterian community, was astounded by the religious factionalism he encountered there.
Here, every man's hand was against his brother. The possibility of Christian cooperation was absolutely limited to these little cliques into which the body of Christ was divided.
The town was also divided over the issue of slavery. This rift came to the fore in 1838, when a Kentucky couple arrived in Jacksonville, accompanied by 2 of their slaves. Some Jacksonville residents convinced the slaves, Bob and Emily Logan, that they were legally free now that they were in Illinois. They helped the Logans to escape and find shelter with the free black family. Then another set of citizens helped to kidnap Bob back. Emily, however, evaded capture.
The shock to the whole community occasioned by this outrage is beyond description. From that time onward, there was a slow but steady progress in the anti-slavery sentiment.
The case of Emily and Bob Logan did in fact bolster Jacksonville's reputation among abolitionists. The town eventually became a stop on the Underground Railroad. Meanwhile, community members were promoting the development of the actual railroad. An editorial composed by one citizen in February of 1855 captures the community's sense that railroad links would be essential to the town's future.
Jacksonville has thus far attained a fair start in the race with her sister towns in the state. But if she neglects laying a firm basis by securing those commercial advantages now within her reach, she may yet be outstripped and shorn of much future prosperity.
By 1860, Jacksonville had 5 separate rail links, along which they exported wheat, pork, and beef. But the ambitions of Jacksonville's early settlers only met with moderate success.
Many came here with no idea of permanent stay, but as a place for outlook for a future home still further on in the wilds.
Jacksonville remained a community of continual migration, as the lure of the frontier beyond increased with each passing year. The seemingly infinite western frontier was a major factor in making the mid-19th century a time of unprecedented economic opportunity for white Americans.
Americans took advantage of this opportunity. It's a very hard-working country, and they do bring in new acreage. They do move west. They do go into new industries. They do begin to innovate and invent, build manufacturing in the Northeast. When they do this, and as they prosper, they say, we've prospered because of our democratic institutions. So to them, certainly for this generation, economic and political freedom seem to be absolutely supporting each other.
There develops a free labor ideology, a set of beliefs around free labor that's very important in this period. The idea that northern wage laborers were free to accept the terms of their employment or not, that they were not under compulsion to do this work, that they could benefit from the wages they earned and from the resources that they controlled.
Increasingly in the North, people view the South with disdain. The South has a growing economy of its own, but it's a much different type of economic growth. It's more based on cotton, plantations, and slaves. And people in the North increasingly view that economy as falling behind the times. People in the North began to celebrate the virtues of what they called a free labor economy dominated by small farmers, by small enterprises, in which men could rise up through the social system and achieve landed independence. And they increasingly viewed the South as a society in which the majority of people, whether slaves or poor whites, were exploited by large plantation owners who generated most of the wealth for themselves. And so Northerners view themselves increasingly as special, as a kind of driving progressive force of the nation.